Okay, we're going to continue that part about the herbivores and the rest of the comparison to the carnivores and omnivores. So we're going to move on to the digestion of a meal, in particular the role of microbes in these species, and again compare the roles of the extra GI organs to GI function in these species. Again, we've gone through the carnivores and we're working on the herbivores. Summary slide at the end. Meal digestion. So this is a review, but we talked about in our carnivores and omnivores about digestion of the regular carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and as they move through the GI tract. We also talked about the different feedstuffs and how they get absorbed in the different areas of the GI tract. So now we're going to compare that starting with the horses. So the problem with horses is they eat all those things. They eat carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, just like dogs do, but they also eat grasses. And their carbohydrates can be a bit different. So they often eat corn, oats, and or barley, which are cereals, carbohydrates, sugar beet pulp. They get given fat supplements, and they eat proteins, which tend to be the legumes like alfalfa leaves. But they also eat pasture grasses and hay or hay cubes. So what we refer to these differences in the carbohydrates, because both hays and grasses and grains are carbohydrates, we didn't name them very well. So now we call them non-structural carbohydrates, which is a very convoluted term for regular carbs, so your cereal grains, and structural carbohydrates, which means it's in a plant covered by cellulose. So basically, structural carbohydrates have cellulose, and cellulose is hard to digest. Our GI tract does not contain cellulase to break down cellulose. So if we were going to look at this in comparison to the to the carnivores and omnivores, we remove the salivary amylase. They don't really have that. And we shift things over because now we have to do some more digestion at the end of the path. So they still do digestion of proteins in the stomachs and the small intestine, add in the bile and pancreatic enzymes. But now we have to talk about how to digest that cellulose. And there are bacteria in the cecum and the colon, remember that very elongated colon, that do contain the enzyme cellulase, and the bacteria can digest cellulose. So we have the bacteria in there that digest the cellulose, and in exchange, they produce energy compounds in the form of volatile fatty acids, and they produce some B vitamins that are essential for horses to have. And this is really the only way those horses usually get those B vitamins is through these microbes producing it. So again, we're working on this far end bit. The microbes are living in the cecum and the colon and doing their business of digesting in that area. So if we were to look at the digestion process for the monogastric herbivores, again, we start at the stomach, small intestine, add in the bile and the pancreatic enzymes. But that only takes care of the regular carbs and the proteins and the fats. We still have to deal with the non-structural carbohydrates. So those end up in the colon and the cecum, digested by cellulase, which is produced by the microbes. And the digestion products and the end products. So instead of eating pasta, they eat cereal grains as is, and those are digested by pancreatic lipase and absorbed in the small intestine. Proteins generally come in the form of the legumes, more like the beans. Alfalfa is a legume that the leaves are high in protein and are often fed to horses, and their supplements are straight. And those are digested into amino acids, just like in the carnivores. They're given fat supplements in their rations. Those require bile salts to be emulsified and absorbed. And then the structural carbohydrates, the hays and the grasses, are digested by the bacteria. And those are volatile fatty acids and B vitamins that are produced in exchange are usually absorbed in the colon. There are some monogastric herbivores, such as rabbits, that reingest that pellet that contains all of those products in it, and then it goes through the regular absorption process like a carnivore would. Cattle. Cattle are very similar to horses, really, except for that microbial digestion part is moved in front of the stomach. So it's moved into the forestomach or the rumen, and that's where the cellulose digestion occurs by bacteria producing cellulase. And again, then the B vitamins and the volatile fatty acids are absorbed in the forestomach instead of the hindgut. As a reminder, just to change where the bacteria live, whether it's in the forestomach or the hindgut. digestion products, again, are pretty similar to horses in that they eat the grains. The protein products often come from the bacteria, because remember, these bacteria are living in the rumen. As the bacteria die off, they move down the rest of the GI tract and are a protein source for the cattle. And as mentioned before, then instead of being absorbed in the hindgut, the volatile fatty acids are absorbed from the rumen. Camelids are really pretty much like cattle, except we've renamed their fourth stomachs into C1 and C2 instead of the rumen and the reticulum. And products, again, are pretty much the same as cattle, except instead of being absorbed in the rumen, the volatile fatty acids are absorbed in C1. And as we talked about in the carnivores and the omnivores, dysfunction in any part of the GI tract can impair nutrient absorption. So whether that's chewing, the esophagus, the small intestine, the cecum. But in this part, it can also include microbial dysfunction. So if we don't have the right microbes or don't have healthy microbes in the rumen, it can also upset nutrient absorption in our ruminants. And the good news is the other organ systems really pretty much repeat what happens in the carnivores and omnivores. The liver still produces the bile necessary for fat digestion and balances out our energy levels. The pancreas still produces amylase and lipase and trypsin, neutralizes gastric acid, etc. The kidneys still can lose protein with kidney disease in our other species as well. And the brain still responds to the sights and sounds of food and can moderate motility depending on stress levels. Nausea and vomiting are rare in our herbivore species. Remember, they eructate normally, and you can occasionally see projectile vomiting, but it's really, really unusual. And horses do not vomit because of more of anatomical structures than anything else. So again, they can still be impacted by all those organ systems, though. And a summary slide for you, remembering that ruminants and camelids regurgitate to chew their food, and that they've been modified GI tract to have more time to further digest the structural carbohydrates. And they need those microbes. Where the microbes live varies by species. It could be in the forestomach or the hindgut or in the cecum. But they do digest their cereals, proteins, and fats the same way as the carnivores and omnivores, despite a slight change in the protein sources across species. And then we'll talk more about in other courses about how you use volatile fatty acids as an energy source, but they do produce those and B vitamins for the horse, and we can still get changes in GI tract function with extra GI organs and with changes in microbes. Some really good videos on this one for you to pay attention to. The 3D Horse Digestion Guide is a really nice review. There's a couple of quirks in there, like they don't really put a pancreas in any place, but I think you'll figure it out. And there's a great one about why rabbits eat the night feces.